Welcome to the examination of a revolutionary game that Aron Nimzowitsch considered one of his most instructive. According to Fred Reinfeld, this game represents one of the most dramatic moments in chess history, as Nimzowitsch completely revolutionized the concept of controlling the center. Traditionally, it was believed that the side with pawns in the central squares controlled this crucial area of the board. In this game, however, Nimzowitsch challenges this conventional wisdom by voluntarily surrendering his pawn center, while still exerting tremendous pressure on the center with his pieces and completely paralyzing his opponent's entire army. So let's dive into this groundbreaking game. Nimzowitsch starts with e4 and his opponent Salve plays the French defense, e6, and after d4, d5, Nimzowitsch opts for the advanced variation, crossing the center of the board, creating a pawn chain, grabbing space in the center and on the king side, and blockading black pawns in order to cramp black's position. Black, however, immediately attacks the base of white pawn chain, threatening to capture on d4, after which the e5 pawn wouldn't be defended by a pawn anymore and would become weak. That's why white reinforces the d4 pawn by playing c3. Black develops the queen's knight, increasing the pressure on the center. White develops the king's knight, reinforcing the center, and black puts more pressure on the central d4 pawn and targeting the b2 pawn, preventing white's dark squared bishop from being developed, as the bishop must keep an eye on the b2 pawn. And Nimzowitsch develops the king's bishop, and in this position it would be better for black to exchange on d4, because at the moment the d4 pawn is defended by another pawn, by the c3 pawn, but after black captures on d4, which black didn't do in our game, white would be forced to capture with a pawn, and this time the pawn on d4 wouldn't be defended by a pawn anymore, and white would be forced to defend this pawn with his pieces. Of course, black cannot capture on d4 right away. That would be a terrible blunder, because after queen takes d4, white plays bishop b5 check, winning the queen. But instead of capturing on d4 right away, black can play bishop d7, this time threatening to capture on d4, because after the exchanges on d4, white wouldn't have bishop b5 check anymore. And that means white must do something about this pawn. And the only way to save the pawn would be to lose a tempo by moving the already developed bishop in order to open the queen's way and defending the pawn. Or another choice white has, if he doesn't want to lose a tempo, is to play in the gambit style and castling kingside, sacrificing the d4 pawn. But in our game, instead of first capturing on d4 and only then playing bishop d7, black plays bishop d7 right away. And we have reached one of the most dramatic moments in chess history, because now Nimzowitsch will create a new philosophy of the center. According to traditional principles, white must do everything he can in order to retain the pawns in the center, in order to retain his pawn chain. Black at the moment is threatening to capture on d4 and win a pawn. For this reason, white can play, according to traditional principles, bishop e2, for example, defending the pawn. In this case, the position would remain more or less equal. But now comes, instead of this, instead of bishop e2, follows a move that had a shocking effect on Nimzowitsch's contemporaries. According to Fred Reinfeld, this is one of the deepest moves ever made. So Nimzowitsch voluntarily exchanges his central pawn for black c-pawn, leaving the e5 pawn without the protection of a pawn and letting his opponent develop the bishop on a great square from which it controls the crucial central d4 square, and with a tempo. Black is also attacking f2. At first sight, all this doesn't make any sense, but Nimzowitsch has his point. First, he castles. Black immediately attacks white's second pawn, which restricts him, of course. He wants to get rid of this pawn, after which white will not have a single pawn in the center, while black will have both of his central pawns, after which black was going to push the e-pawn forward, solving his main problem, the problem of the bad bishop, which is currently restricted by its own pawn, and black was going to get a mobile pawn center on d5 and e5. So in case black manages to do it, he would have a great position. But Nimzowitsch, of course, had foreseen all this, and he will prevent all this, as you will see. But at the moment, black is threatening to capture on e5. So white must do something about it. If white captures on f6, this will only contribute to black's development. Black would capture on f6, followed by e5 later in the game, and would get a mobile pawn center, open the bishop's diagonal, and would get a great position. What else can white do? e5 is under attack. He might try queen e2, which would look like the most obvious move, defending the pawn, but this time white would capture, and after the exchanges, white would be forced to capture with the queen. The queen, of course, would blockade the pawn, but the queen is a bad blockader. The queen isn't a suitable piece for the blockade, because it can easily be kicked out of the blockading square. The queen would attack g7, but black would develop the knight, followed by bishop d6, kicking out the queen from e5, followed by e5, and again black would get a great position. But instead of all this, Nimzowitsch, instead of capturing on f6 or queen e2, Nimzowitsch makes another great move. He would love to play bishop f4, of course, to defend the e5 pawn. But he cannot do it because the b2 pawn is under attack. So Nimzowitsch plays b4 in order to liberate his bishop and kick black's bishop from c5, which is very active, which controls the very important, the crucial square, the d4 square and e5 squares. These two squares are the crucial squares in this game. At first sight, again, this advance, b4 advance, goes against traditional principles, because by playing b4, white has turned his c-pawn into a backward pawn and permanently weakened the c4 square, and both of these weaknesses are placed on the c-file, and black might put pressure on it. However, a pawn or a square can be considered truly weak only if the opponent can exploit its weakness. And as the game will show, Nimzowitsch won't let his opponent exploit these weaknesses. So after b4, the bishop must retreat, and now that the bishop is liberated, the bishop f4 follows. Black now has difficulties in developing the king's knight, because the f6 square is occupied by the pawn. So black captures on e5, eliminating white's second central pawn and vacating the f6 square for the knight. Nimzowitsch captures on e5, creating a threat, an immediate threat, queen h5 check. And after g6, white would simply capture on g6, as the h-pawn would be pinned, of course. So the rook would fall under attack. For this reason, if black plays knight f6 to prevent queen h5, that wouldn't work, because white would capture on d7 and black would lose the right to castle. After knight takes d7, again white would play queen h5 check, and again black cannot play g6 because of bishop takes g6 check. For this reason, after knight e5, as knight f6 doesn't work, black captures on e5, and Nimzowitsch captures with the bishop. And now we can see his idea. Black has two central pawns, while white doesn't have a single pawn in the center, but it's white who dominates the center, because the e6 pawn is blockaded by the bishop, and the bishop dominates both of these crucial squares. Besides that, the bishop defends the only weakness white has, the c3 pawn, and as the e6 pawn is blockaded, the bishop, black's light-squared bishop, is bad, and it will stay bad until the end of the game. So white is dominating the center. Instead of pawns on e5 and d4, white pieces will occupy these squares. So what to do now? g7 is under attack. In case black tries to challenge white's domination on the dark squares in the center and plays bishop f6, again queen h5 check would follow. And after g6, bishop takes g6 check, h takes g. This time white cannot capture the rook, of course, because it's defended, but white can capture on g6 check, and also attacking the bishop. And after king e7, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, queen g7 check. White gets his piece back, getting two extra pawns. For this reason, instead of bishop f6, black plays knight f6. And now it's time to bring the knight into play. knight d2. The knight is heading to f3, from which it will control both of the crucial dark squares. Black castles, and of course knight f3 follows. So, what to do now? Black's position is cramped. He doesn't have any counterplay. The only active counterplay he might get on the c-file doesn't make any sense because the c3 pawn is defended by the bishop. His light-squared bishop is bad. In case he tries to solve his main problem of the bad bishop and plays bishop b5 in order to exchange his bishop for white's good bishop, Nimzowitsch prepared bishop d4, opening the e-file with a tempo, and after the queen moves, exchanging the bishops and playing knight g5, white is winning the pawn. There is no way black can defend it. He can try, but white will attack the pawn one more time and the pawn would fall. For this reason, as bishop b5 doesn't work, black plays bishop d6, hoping to exchange pieces and get some relief in the cramped position. In a cramped position, it's always a good idea to exchange pieces. Nimzowitsch overprotects his strong point. The e5 square is his strong point. Now it would be better for black to exchange on e5. But in this case, of course, white would capture with the knight and get a great centralized knight on e5 square. For this reason, black avoided the immediate exchange and played rook c8 in order to exchange next move, after which white won't be able to capture with the knight because his c3 pawn would fall. So, if black manages to exchange on e5 next move, white would be forced to capture with the queen in order to defend the c3 pawn. But the queen, of course, is a bad blockader. For this reason, as black is threatening to capture on e5 next move, Nimzowitsch avoids the exchange, retreating to d4 with a tempo, so retaining his bishop. The bishop would keep defending the pawn and vacating the e5 square for the knight in order to achieve an absolute blockade. The queen must move and knight e5. So white doesn't have pawns on e5 and d4, but he has a great knight and a great bishop which completely blockades black's whole position. Bishop e8 and rook e1, overprotecting even more. So black doesn't know what to do. He simply doesn't have any active plan. The knight is simply intolerable on e5. It dominates the whole board. If black tries to get rid of this knight by playing knight d7 in order to exchange his knight for the white knight, white would get a devastating attack on the king side, because the knight on f6 was the main defender of the king side, and now that it's on d7, white would exchange on d7, black would be forced to capture with the bishop to protect the e6 pawn, but on e8 the bishop was controlling the h5 square, and now that it's on d7, white would play queen h5, threatening to capture on h7, and black's king side would collapse. If g6, then bishop takes g6, of course, followed by checkmate, and if h6, then queen g6, again with terrible threats. For this reason, after rook e1, instead of knight d7, black exchanges his bishop for the knight. Bishop takes e5, eliminating this terrible knight, but now white gets the advantage of two bishops. Attacking the queen. The queen must move, and bishop d4, reopening the file, threatening to capture it and forcing the bishop, the light-squared bishop, to make a decision on what diagonal it wants to stay. At the moment it controls both of these diagonals. Now it has to choose either f7 or d7. It moves to d7 and now it doesn't control this diagonal anymore. So, white is dominating the center. Black is completely paralyzed. He is blockaded. He doesn't have any active counterplay, any active plan, and that means it's time for white to start an attack on the black king. And Nimzowicz's next move signals the beginning of the attack. Queen c2, opening way for the rook. The rook will be rerouted to g3 and brought into the attack on the black king. Also on the third file, of course, on the third rank, of course, the rook will also reinforce white's main weakness on c3. Besides that, Nimzowitsch creates a queen and bishop battery targeting the h7 pawn. What can black do? He doesn't have any active play, so he plays rook f7 to reinforce the 7th rank. Of course, it doesn't make any sense for white to capture on f6, exchanging his great bishop for the knight, because black would simply capture with a pawn, and the rook would defend the h7 pawn, and the pawn on f6 would control the e5 square, and black would push the pawn forward, breaking the blockade and getting a great position. Of course, Nimzowitsch didn't do it, he didn't capture on f6. Instead, he doesn't need to hurry. He brings the rook into the attack, rook e3. Black doesn't know what to do, so he plays b6, and of course rook g3, pinning the g pawn. And now that the pawn is pinned, white is threatening to capture on f6, because black won't be able to capture with the pawn as it's pinned. He would be forced to capture with a rook, after which the h7 pawn would fall. That's why black plays king h8, unpinning the pawn. So, how to continue now? How to continue the attack? You can pause the video and try to find Nimzowicz's brilliant solution. Of course, it still doesn't make any sense to capture on f6. That would be a terrible mistake, because after g takes f, black would defend the pawn, control e5, remove the blockade, and get a great position. Instead, Nimzowitsch sacrifices the bishop on h7. And it turns out that if black accepts the sacrifice and captures the bishop, queen g6 would follow, attacking the rook, attacking the g7 pawn, and also white has an unpleasant threat, rook h3, which would pin and attack the knight for the second time. The only move which would make sense in this position would be king g8, defending the pawn and moving away from the h-file, but in this case, of course, bishop takes g7 would follow, and there is no way black can prevent the checkmate. White is threatening bishop f6 with the discovered check, and after king f8, queen g8 would be checkmate. But black finds a very interesting opportunity. Instead of capturing the bishop, he plays e5, attacking the bishop, finally breaking the blockade, opening the queen's line. Now the queen controls g6, and opening the bishop's diagonal. And it turns out that if white captures on e5, black this time can capture on h7, and white cannot invade g6 anymore, as the black queen controls this square. Neither can white play rook h3, as the bishop controls this square. So in this case, black would simply be up a piece and would even win. But of course, Nimzowitsch didn't capture on e5. Instead, he saves his light-squared bishop, bishop g6, with a tempo, attacking the rook, so black doesn't have time to capture the bishop. He must save the rook, rook e7. Now, again, black is threatening to capture the bishop, but rook e1, pinning the pawn. If black captures, of course, he would lose the rook, and white is threatening to capture on e5. That's why black plays queen d6, defending the pawn, defending the rook, and now that the rook is defended, black again is threatening to capture the bishop. That's why bishop e3. And finally, black plays d4, getting some active play. So, finally the blockade is removed, the bishop's diagonal is open, but it's too late, because white has an extra pawn and two active bishops in an open position, which gives him a big advantage. So, the pawn on d4 attacks the bishop and the pawn is pinned, but Nimzowitsch plays bishop g5, opening the rook's file, the rook's line, and protects the c3 pawn. Rook takes c3, rook takes c3, d takes c, queen takes c3, and again it turns out that black's position is passive. The e5 pawn is attacked twice, and that means black must keep an eye, so his rook and the queen must defend the pawn. The knight is pinned, so black is very passively placed, and he simply improves his king, king g8. Nimzowitsch isn't in a hurry, he reinforces his weakness on b4 by playing a3, king f8, and bishop h4. The idea is to play bishop g3, attacking the e5 pawn for the third time, after which this pawn would fall. Black plays bishop e8, offering the exchange of the bishops. Nimzowitsch avoids the exchange, retaining his bishop pair, bishop f5, and he is still threatening bishop g3 next move, after which the pawn would fall. That's why black plays queen d4, which leads to the exchange of the major pieces. Rook takes e7, king takes e7. And again, black has a passed pawn, but Nimzowitsch blockades it. Bishop d3, even in the endgame. Nimzowitsch blockades the pawns. So the knight is pinned, so black plays king d6, moving towards the center and unpinning the knight. And one of the advantages of having two bishops is that you can usually exchange one of them to get a winning position. And that's exactly what Nimzowitsch does. Bishop takes f6, deflecting the black pawn from the g file, after which the h-pawn turns into a passed pawn. After king f1, bishop c6, h4, it turns out that the h-pawn will move forward, after which the g-pawn will move. White will create connected passed pawns on the g and h files, while black passed pawn is blockaded and it will be eliminated. That's why in this hopeless position black resigned. And now I recommend watching one of the greatest games played by Nimzowitsch, which had a shocking effect on the chess world. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.